Good morning. Before I begin, let me just thank the organizers for inviting the Philippine Institute for Development Studies to give this presentation. And also as a background, I am just part of the team that worked on this presentation last year when we were asked by the Board of Trustees of the Philippine Institute for Development Studies to explore the impact of closing the Boracay Island to tourists. All right, so these are the members of the team. Dr. Celia Reyes is the president of the Philippine Institute for Development Studies. Dr. Albert and myself are research fellows. And we also had the assistance of Cristina Ortiz and Ronina Assis, who are also staff at the IDF. So I am here to present the study, which essentially aims to assess ex ante the impact of the Boracay closure to the economy. Quick estimate that what we are trying to do is, or what we wanted to do is to provide a quick estimate of the impact without really looking too much about what's going to be the benefit for the environment. Because it's very difficult to quantify impacts to the environment. So essentially what we are just looking at is what's the cost? What would be the cost of closing? The benefits, maybe it will come in a next study. So this is how the presentation will proceed. So first, let me tell you about what's happening, what happened with the Boracay closure, and then maybe a profile of the Boracay Island. But maybe I don't need to because I'm sure everyone's familiar with the island. How much are we going to lose, or how much will we lose if we close the island using some economic models, and then ways forward, of course. So what happened? The Boracay closure aims to address ecological issues in the Boracay Island. So the government decided to close the island from entry of local and foreign tourists for 6 months, starting April 26. The sewerage system is not properly integrated in the island for businesses and residents alike. And we found, using the data from the local government and from the Philippine Statistics Authority, that only 2/3 of the 578 business customers of the Boracay Island Water Company are connected to the sewerage treatment plant. Also, only 1 in 5 DOT accredited hotels and restaurants are connected to the main sewer system, and the rest dispose directly at sea. So, because of all these issues, the decision was unanimously made by DENR, DILG, and DOT to close the island. So what is this island that we're talking about? So the Boracay Island is part of the municipality of Malay in the province of Aklan, I'm sure you know. And it is 10.32 square kilometer island. It has a population of about 32,267 across 3 barangays, with mainland Malay accounting for 20,706 residents. And this is a profile of the businesses and establishments in the island. For how do you interpret this slide? For example, in the accommodation and food and beverage sector, 94.2% of the workers there in the province of in Malay, the municipality of Malay, 94.2 are actually working in the island of Boracay. And as you can see, for almost all key sectors and industries in the municipality, majority is actually contained in the island of Boracay, and that is true for almost for passenger transport, recreation, retail trade, travel agents, and even other sectors. And if we look at it in the general picture, overall, on average, Boracay employs 85.9% of Malay's 17,229 workers and 72.6% of the 4,500 registered businesses as of December 2017. So one could think that the island is actually the focal point of business and employment in the island. So looking at the national household targeting system for poverty reduction to provide us a data on in terms of poor persons and non-poor persons in the island, we found that the majority of the poor in Boracay are laborers and unskilled workers, followed by those working in special occupations. The majority of poor in mainland Malay are laborers and unskilled workers, followed by farmers, forestry workers, and fishermen. And the majority of the poor in Malay are laborers and unskilled workers, followed by farmers, forestry workers, and fishermen. For the non-poor, the majority of non-poor in Boracay are plant and machine operators and assemblers, followed by laborers and unskilled workers. The majority for the mainland Malay are laborers and unskilled workers, followed by plant and machine operators and assemblers. So one can think that those who get wages coming from the bigger, as laborers and as plant and machine operators, tend to have better income and become non-poor. While those who are working as farmers and as unskilled workers tend to have lower income and actually become poor. So looking at data in terms of profile of tourist arrivals, the most popular of Boracay's beaches is the White Beach, stretching 4 kilometers and one of the longest of its kind in Asia. Most tourism development is focused on the Barangay Balabag, where White Beach is located, and leading alternatives to Boracay in Southeast Asia are Bali, Indonesia, and Phuket, Thailand. So from 2001 to 2017, visitor headcounts and tourist receipts in Boracay have been consistently increasing each year. The highest increase in visitor arrivals was in 2012 at 32.7% growth. Visitor receipts in terms of millions of pesos has grown at an average of 16.5% annually from 4.9 billion to 2001 to 56.1 billion in 2017. I think I have an additional data there. So about the growth of tourist receipts so Boracay tourist receipts account for 20% of Philippine tourist receipts in 2015 and 2016. That's an important statistic. So I want you to remember that as we go along towards the results of the CGE model. So 20% of the Philippine tourist receipts is accounted for by Boracay. So what are the reasons why the Boracay was closed? So these are just some of the reasons that were identified in literature and in other earlier studies. So low sewerage, violations of laws, non-compliance in coliform standards, and destroyed wetland areas. So given this, we were tasked to find out what is the impact of the Boracay island closure. If we're going to close the island, we were asked, what is it going to cost the government or the economy of the Philippines? So how did we do this? So we used an analysis using the input-output table and some reasonable assumptions. What did we do? So we used data from the PSA that suggests that Boracay contributed 20% to total Philippine tourism, or about 48.9 billion in 2016. And then we made some assumptions. What are these? For instance, under the assumption that domestic and foreign tourists would behave differently when faced with the closure, Philippines would only be losing a small portion of the 20% of tourism receipts. For instance, if you are a local tourist and you find out that the Boracay is going to be closed, then you can be diverted, or you would divert your travel to maybe Bohol or Cebu or somewhere near. Limitations in available data prevent the modeling of an accurate distribution of the loss from the closure, differentiating between domestic and local tourists. But it would be safe to assume that domestic tourists would more likely divert to other tourist spots, as I mentioned, thereby preserving tourist receipts. As for foreign tourists, their capacity to proceed to other tourist spots in the country would be dependent on their knowledge of other tourist spots and as well as their spending power. So what did we do? So we had three assumptions. So first, the scenario is a 5% reduction of the tourist receipts. This is the good scenario. Then we had a medium scenario, 10% reduction of the tourist receipts. And then the scenario is 20% reduction or almost an entire closure of the Boracay Island. So here are the results. So for instance, using the input-output analysis, we find that these are the sectors that would be adversely affected. And then in terms of income, income effects would range from 7 billion loss to 27.9 billion loss. And accommodation and restaurants are the top that would be most affected. Note that about 1/3 of the workers in Boracay are in the accommodation and food and beverage industry. So these are the people that would be mostly affected. And then what did we do next? All right. So, okay, this first. So I'm running out of time, but what we did next is we moved on from the input-output analysis to a computable general equilibrium analysis. The difference is that we want to look at the impact in terms of prices. So if you close Boracay, the assumption is that there would be a loss in supply of tourist characteristic products. So there would be a shift in your supply curve upward, driving prices upward. So if there's a more, in terms of the supply of, if the prices in terms of tourist products is higher, so then the consumption, what would be the impact in terms of consumption, in terms of export of services, etc., etc. So what did we do? We tried to model that closure using a CGE model, and we found out that other sectors, so not just the tourism sectors, and transport and travel and accommodation, but also agriculture, industry, and services would also be affected, but very slightly. The Boracay closure, by reducing the supply of tourist characteristic products, increases the supply of these products, as I mentioned earlier. Then we would see higher prices in the supply price of and this would reduce the consumption of households. Households would thereby reduce their consumption by this much. And then it would also impact our exports. Higher supply prices would also reduce the consumption of tourists as measured by reduction in exports, resulting in the overall reduction in output. Okay. So after all those numbers, let me just try to put them into words. What we found is that transportation and tourism would be adversely affected the most, although some adverse effects would also be felt by agriculture and manufacturing sectors. We also found that accommodation and restaurants are the top industries that would lose the most, and these two would actually employ 1/3 of Boracay's workers. The impact of the closure will be borne mostly by the tourism industry, as we actually think. So ways forward. So just the last slide. So just for the ways forward, while the economic value of Boracay can mostly be seen in the revenue generated from tourism, and thus the economic value of the closure is equated to the potential loss of revenues from various streams, as suggested in the previous section, the closure will still have its direct and indirect effects to the people living in Boracay and the entire municipality of Malay. So ways forward, we actually suggest these further improvements. So there's a need to increase mangrove cover, restore coral reefs, protect and rehabilitate seagrass beds. We need to also carry out effective zoning, relocate informal settlers, and regulate fisheries and water sports, and also identify the Boracay Island's carrying capacity and determine if new firms will potentially overload its carrying capacity. As in any calamity, the ecological crisis in the island will seriously affect living conditions of the poor as well as the non-poor with low incomes. So the study is also available online if you can visit the PIDS website here. So if you want further details, especially in terms of the assumptions and the analysis, and I would be looking forward to your questions. Thank you.